Today we're going to do the what, the why and the how of hatching. I'm going to show you how I hatch and what I think makes the most effective hatching in ink drawing, giving you some really key things to do, but even more importantly sometimes the things I see when I'm reviewing my students' work and what not to do, what to avoid. And without further ado, then let's just dive in. So firstly, what is hatching? And I'm sure you may well know exactly what we're talking about. Hatching is the idea of building up texture or value through lines, through ink marks. So we create hatching like this, linear hatching. It can go in any direction. We can have cross hatching, where we go in one direction and then another, and perhaps even then another. And by doing this, you can see we're going from sort of nothing through to dark. And that's part of the why. So why are we doing this? And that's all about, firstly, value. That's one of the most common uses. So here we've got 0 value. That's a bright white page. We've got a value of, perhaps we can call this 1, where it's a little bit darker. Then we can have 2. And here we might make really dense vertical hatching. So it's a bit darker than that. Or we might cross hatch. And you can see we now built up 1, 2, and 3. And this is how we create shadows. And shadows are the key to creating real shape. If we draw, for example, a square and another square, this is a square and a square in perspective. Doesn't look like much until you just apply some really simple hatching down one side and maybe even on the floor, and pop in a horizon line behind, and now we have a cube stood on a table. And that cube has got that shape, it feels 3D because we've applied a bit of tone. We might even apply extra tone to imply a deeper shadow at the base, as you sometimes get when you, depending on the light source and where it's coming from. The other thing about hatching is it applies texture. So you can see this is smooth, this is smooth, these have a texture. So if you're hatching, for example, in a tree, we do a very simple tree, you might use just simple linear hatching to imply texture in that tree. Or you might want to, for example, let's make this one a bush instead, you might want to do hatching built from little leaf-like marks. So we end up with textures which are building up our value, our shadows, and making something a little bit more 3D. We could keep going and with, etching and really detailed ink drawing. Actually, these little textural marks, these little bits of hatching, this sort of idea of creating value is incredibly key to getting something accurate. Equally, in a looser style of sketching and drawing like I enjoy doing really quick sheets to make things interesting, make things feel busy with hatching is a really valuable technique to get my ideas across, to get my scene on the page far more quickly. And that moves us on to how in this sort of whirlwind tour of hatching. And that seems really silly, doesn't it? Of course we know how to draw these lines, it's just drawing lines. But there are some really key ideas that we need to be thinking about, mistakes which people I see often making, including myself when I'm not thinking about it. So the first thing is to think about the direction of your hatching. And a simple way to start is if we have a street like this coming towards us, and we might have some shadow coming down it. So we just draw in some little windows, we've got sort of shop fronts underneath, often quite dark in there. What we want to do is avoid making this really messy. So if I just sort of hatch like so, and I'm scribbling and just sort of trying to build up the tone any old how, do you see what's happened? This is now overworked. It lacks structure. You can't see the original lines I made because it's lost behind these really busy lines. And we don't really understand the planes either of this because these lines are just going anywhere and everywhere. If we come back, let's draw the same little house again, or series of houses, series of buildings, I should say. And we'll just try and keep them really simple again, like I could do anything else, of course. I'm very, very simple. So everything I draw is always quite simple. And there we go, just a couple of windows. Now, before we jump in there, let's think about what we're doing. So firstly, we want our hatching to be consistent. And this means a few things. So it means consistent in direction. Now that can be that there's all the hatching in one direction, or it can be, for example here, we might go consistently vertical, and then we want a little bit of shadow on the ground, and that shadow can suddenly be in a different plane. But on this ground, all of the hatching is going to be consistent, so consistent in direction. And that starts to tell us that we've got a vertical structure and a horizontal plane as well. It starts to tell us a lot more information than a simple bit of scribbling does. We want it consistent in weight. So if I was to do this, really light, really bold, really light, bold, light, 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 bold, bold. And also, you can see here, I've changed the sort of length. So we'll put weight and length. That's chaotic and challenging. That's what I've done here. Instead, we want the weight and the length of all this hatching to be about the same. Not perfect, but about the same. That keeps it in the background. It prevents it from coming in front and creating chaos in front of our presumably hard work sketch that we don't want to ruin. We don't want to spend a long time getting the structure of our scene. And that's kind of what I've done here. Relatively uniform in direction and not having these little tail offs. So often people will twist around at the end. They'll have these little, they're trying to hatch really quickly, so it flops around. So you don't want, we'll put no tails as the next little segment of my do not do. So we've got direction, weight, line, and no tails. And we want it to be, as well, just sort of quiet and calm, even in a very loose sketch. Even if I was sort of coming up and drawing little loose leaves coming up, what we don't want is excessive noise above all of this sort of loopy line work, and actually doing really simple light hatching will be far more effective and will create far more shape and keep our sort of scene intact. Now the other thing, the final thing to think about is making sure that the structure comes through. So if I just put structure here to remind myself, and what we're trying to do now is make sure that those initial lines are still nice and bold. And this sends the hatching to the back. It's important not to overdo this, because then we'll end up with a scene which is a bit too much like a cartoon or an illustration. But at the same time, by just emboldening the lines near the hatching, it has the effect of making sure the hatching is not the star of the show. And the hatching is adding something, it's adding to the structure of our scene, rather than taking away from it, rather than become chaotic. And you can always do a little bit more. You can do some naturalistic sort of hatching with little bricks and things. You can also just block in, ignore the hatching and decide you want this maximal darkness in some places, maybe even in some areas under here, or maybe we can add a little sort of roof line, and some of these chimneys give them real shape by giving them a really dark shadow on one side. And there you go, a really very simple guide to hatching. The what, it's just linear marks, often building up tone, value, creating texture, and how, keeping it consistent, keeping it not the star of the show, but adding to the structure that you've spent your hard-earned, hard-spent ink creating. So thank you everyone for watching my little sketching videos. If you enjoy my content, please do subscribe to my channel, because it makes me really, really happy. Thanks again.